Hello, my name is Sam Robson and I'm the Medical Director of Temple V. This short webinar explores the question of whether there is evidence that refined carbohydrates are more addictive than cocaine, and if so, what can be done to help. Now, few people would rush into taking drugs like cocaine. Aside from it not being legal, there may be a fear about the effect that this drug would have on us, especially when we cannot be sure of what exactly we're being sold. But we also may fear, if we're honest, developing a dependency that we can't control. So how could cocaine in any way possibly be compared to refined carbohydrates? I will explain the underlying brain biochemistry, which I hope will clarify this comparison. But firstly, let's consider addiction itself. So what is addiction? Well, addiction is a brain disorder, and it happens when the addicted individual has become dependent on a particular thing. We are more familiar with this stimuli being alcohol, drugs, or gambling. And addiction is when we keep doing something that initially gives us pleasure, but then find we can't resist it despite the negative consequences, and so we are said to be addicted to it. In terms of brain biochemistry, the addictive stimulus, alcohol, drugs, or gambling, causes an increase in dopamine production. The brain gets flooded with dopamine with each exposure, and this saturates the pleasure centers in the brain, so that initially there is an overwhelming sense of feeling good. However, this constant bombardment of the pleasure centers with dopamine unsurprisingly causes the brain to tire of it and adapt, and so in time it becomes less sensitive to dopamine because of this pleasure overload. The brain downregulates its dopamine receptors, which means you would need more dopamine to cause a similar effect. It's kind of like putting in earplugs to cut out the excess noise. This is known as tolerance, and this means that the brain can cope with a high level of dopamine when the addictive behavior is pursued. However, just as constantly wearing earplugs means that you just can't hear unless the volume is turned up, this damping down effect ultimately leads to a situation where the dopamine sensitivity to this substance is so downgraded that you need repetitive fixes just to feel normal, and so the individual suffers unpleasant consequences when the stimuli are withdrawn. This is more commonly known as withdrawal. And with most addictive behaviours, the addict is chasing that initial high and therefore finds it hard to resist the temptation to engage with the addictive behaviour. And, when faced with the unpleasant sensation of withdrawal, the addict has learned what is needed to take the nasty feelings away. So, back to cocaine. This is derived from the coca plant. This is a plant which for years has been treasured by indigenous communities in South America and is chewed or made into tea. It is valued as a mild, mood-enhancing, cheap stimulant, kind of like coffee. But if you refine it down to a fine white powder, you create a highly addictive substance, cocaine. This produces an immediate high when consumed and causes the user to initially feel great. So the refining process undergone by the coca plant effectively intensifies and concentrates the end product cocaine, and the pharmacological effect of this on the brain is dramatically enhanced. So how does cocaine affect our brains? And what is behind that feeling great? Well, cocaine has a rapid effect on the brain pleasure centers. It causes a rapid and dramatic surge in dopamine release, which floods the brain with a sense of feeling good. And if you recall, this is one of the main prerequisites for establishing an addiction. So with repeated dosing, the brain has a self-preserving need to quieten this noise. And so the dopamine receptors become less sensitive and downregulate, and thus higher doses are required to get the same effects. And so we develop tolerance, soon resulting in withdrawal symptoms of anxiety and low mood when cocaine is not immediately available. So how are refined carbohydrates like cocaine? Well, remember that cocaine is a powder produced by refining the coca plant. White sugar and white flour have been created by highly refining the original plant, which in this case is sugar beets and wheat, and then you have a fine white powdery substance. These refined powders, white sugar and white flour, both have a high glycemic index, which means that when they're eaten, they trigger a rapid rise in blood sugar. This in turn impacts on the blood dopamine receptors and so floods the brain with dopamine, just like cocaine. Now, there's an interesting relationship between blood glucose and insulin, and I hope to explain why this relationship can conspire to make us fat. High blood sugar levels are toxic to the body, so the body protects itself by producing insulin, which rapidly and effectively pushes the excess sugar into our fat stores. But in rapidly reducing the blood sugar, we become hungry again and crave more high glycemic index food. So here we have it. Substances that rapidly raise our blood sugar, like refined sugar and white flour, these flood our dopamine receptors, which make us feel good, and we all know how good that first piece of chocolate is. And then insulin rescues us from the excess sugar flooding our fat stores, and so we gain weight. The balance between blood sugar and insulin is an interesting one. Insulin is so effective at protecting us from the toxic effects of having a high blood sugar level that we can enter a cycling spiral of high sugar and high insulin. And as our baseline circulating insulin levels rise, we effectively become insulin resistant. This means that whilst constantly pushing the sugar into our fat stores, we're also increasingly hungry for high glycemic index food, typically junk food, because we learn that this will most effectively stave off the extreme hunger caused by the rapidly plummeting blood sugar levels. It's an unfortunate side effect that in managing these sometimes extreme blood sugar and insulin highs and lows, that our fat stores grow rapidly and we can become very overweight. When we are being good and depriving ourselves of these sugar fixes, if we have developed that sugar or high glycemic index addiction, we have learned and thus instinctively know that there is a temporary fix to be found in junk food. So if we're stressed, hungry, in need of comfort, or when willpower is either really pushed and the craving becomes too strong, then the desire for that fix can just take over. But perhaps that explanation is too simple. Where's the science to back it up? Well, brain imaging has shown that gambling, playing video games, and having an orgasm all activate the same pleasure centres as does the sight of appetizing food. High glycemic index foods, when eaten, cause a similar release of brain chemicals as is caused by sex and drugs like cocaine and heroin. Animal experiments have shown that sudden withdrawal from high-fat, high-sugar food often causes emotional withdrawal and anxiety. And let me describe an interesting experiment where rats were offered cheesecake. Initially, they nibbled on it, but once they got used to it, they binged on it and became very overweight. And when the cheesecake was taken away, the rats who were addicted to it were no longer interested in healthy food. So what are the implications of carbohydrate addiction? Well, if this sounds like you, then just stop and think. What are you doing when you just listen to your body? Would anybody advise the alcoholic to give in to their craving to have a drink? Or the newly quit smoker to have a cigarette in order to suppress their nicotine craving? Perhaps we should no more tolerate it as acceptable to concede to a chocolate or junk food craving than we would condone a junkie having another drug-fueling binge. Now, I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that we should punish or judge someone or ourselves who is currently trapped by a high glycemic index addiction, but we should help and support them to address this. We should work with them to devise strategies that can help them regain control. And it may well be that for the short term at least, the red line of eating junk food should not be crossed. There may well be some forbidden foods. It may be that a degree of moderation can be aspired to in the future, but that is for each individual to discover. And in the meantime, we should not just expect people to cope with moderation, and instead of putting pressure on them to lighten up and have some cake because just one piece won't hurt, instead we should applaud and support them in their efforts to break free of their addiction. Temple V is about helping individuals to lose weight quickly and develop healthy eating patterns whilst making smart food choices. We aim to empower people to recognise their triggers, putting strategies in place to ensure that what they choose to eat is motivated by choice and awareness of consequences, rather than as a result of being enslaved by the toxic brain biochemistry caused by an addiction to refined carbohydrates. You can down-regulate your brain dopamine circuitry, and you can lower that insulin resistance. But you need your eyes wide open to what you're eating and to maintain a focus on where you would like to be. We will teach you about tasty food that doesn't trigger the spiral of high sugar, high insulin surges. Of course, this takes self-discipline and control, but this also requires education, support, and understanding. And you also need to accept that reaching this position may take patience and many attempts. We are here to help. Thank you.